Okay, then I guess I will start with the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. I have the pleasure to welcome you to this session on a long relationship, humans and oaks in Britain with Keith Kirby. My name is Christina Becher, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cologne, where I'm working on human-plant hybrids in German literature. I am co-moderating this session with Kevin MacDonald, who is a state government environmental professional and who serves on the Minnesota Shade Tree Advisory Council. Before I will introduce Dr. Kirby, I will briefly say something about the session's procedure. The session will be recorded and it will be made available on YouTube afterwards. Dr. Kirby will present for 30 minutes, and after that, we have another 10 minutes to ask him some questions. I invite you to post your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom app or the Zoom screen. You find this Q&A feature below. Please use the chat just for information or links you want to share with us. Dr. Kirby worked for 30 years as a woodland ecologist with the British Government Conservation Service, where he was concerned with the protection and management of forest biodiversity. Since his retirement, he has picked various research projects looking at long-term change in forests, particularly the flora. Today, we are very excited to learn something about humans and oaks in Britain. Welcome, Dr. Kirby.
Thank you. And hello, everyone, whatever time, whatever place you're in. The first oaks to grow in Britain in the early Holocene, about 10,000 years ago, might have come from acorns discarded by wanderers exploring lands liberated from the ice. And there begins a long tradition of using oak trees for firewood, buildings, chemicals, but also less tangible relationships with the trees, from widely imagined cults of druids to our current fascination in Britain with veteran oaks. And that's what I want to explore in this talk. And by oaks in Britain, we've just got two native species, Quercus roba, Quercus petrea, out of, what is it, more than 400 or so species worldwide. So a very small part of the oak flora. And when I said the fascination with old trees, you can see in the picture a group of about 30 or 40 people. I think venerating is probably the right term. This old oak in a parkland, which also happens to be the only tree in which a particular rare beetle lives in Britain. So it's a survivor as an oak tree. It's also incredibly important as a habitat for this rather peculiar beetle. Anyway, back to the beginning of our story. About 12,000 years ago, most of Britain was still covered by ice, with some areas of open tundra in the south of the country. The oaks that might have been present in previous interglacial periods were far away in refugia south of the Alps, in Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. There may have been small pockets north of the mountain ranges. This is speculation. There is some evidence that they could be there, but it's not certain. However, very rapidly as the climate warmed and the ice retreated, oaks spread back. Much of this was probably due to those acorns being picked up and carried by jays and then planted in open ground, from the jay's point of view, to be recovered sometime later as winter food. but they occasionally forget them and a new oak tree may develop. But as I say, it's possible also that humans were carrying acorns with them as a food source, as they are still occasionally used in Britain today. And certainly by about 8,000 years ago, the oaks had spread back through much of Europe and had reached northern Britain and were a major part of the forests and tree cover that had developed. So oaks then didn't, continue as the main forest trees unchallenged. Beech and lime came through, but there's a long history of looking at oak and associating it with these early forests. Now, our ancestors were moving through these forests, they were hunting in them, they were living in them, and using the wood for firewood to make weapons, tools, houses. But I think possibly they also may have had some sort of spiritual relationship to the trees that were there. Given that our modern reactions faced with these huge beings is a sort of veneration, then I find it not unlikely that our ancestors, who are much the same as we in many respects, would have felt the same sort of awe. What we do know is that they certainly were creating their equivalent of their temples. We don't quite know what they used them, how they used them, but they created these monuments, not just out of stone, as in the famous Stonehenge, but these sorts of circles of large wooden posts. And in some cases, these have been a meter across the trees that were felled. So it wasn't something that you did lightly. It's a major operation to create these henges, either circles or in some cases lines. And artificial islands in swampy ground were created with millions of pieces of wood used to form them. We don't know why, but they did. So they were certainly incorporating wood into their equivalent of perhaps temples. But at the same time, certainly by the Neolithic period, which in Britain is around 6,000 years ago, and the start of farming, then there was widespread deforestation. And clearance of the original forests, the original tree cover, started in a big way, both deliberate clearance through felling or burning of around the trees to kill them, and the impact of herds of cattle on stopping regeneration would also have contributed to the opening up of the landscape. We don't know exactly what that spiritual relationship, if there was one, with the trees was in prehistoric times. But by the time we get to the Romans period, about 2,000 years ago in Britain, there are references in the Roman writings to the fact that the priestly class amongst the British tribes worshipped or certainly made a lot of attention to the parasite mistletoe, and especially if it grew on oaks. I think this is because it very rarely grows on oak, but it was, and therefore it was seen as particularly valuable. It usually grows on apple trees. In fact, there's a lot in the back garden here. Now, I think we've got to take the Roman writings with a little bit of caution, because they are writing about what they would see as the barbarian tribes at the outermost edges of their empire. And I think it's about the same sort of credibility in many cases as a 19th century British newspaper writing about the activities of the indigenous people of Australia or of Western Canada. It might be true, but it could easily be a total pack of lies. Now, so again, not a lot of evidence for certain, but at least a suggestion that people viewed trees with awe. Moving on a little bit to early Welsh and Irish literature, or subsequent writing downs of oral traditions from about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, then you start to get references to trees and different species of tree that we can recognize and know today and their properties. And oak is seen as the chieftain tree. And there is this strong and continuing tradition of seeing oak as you know, perhaps the most important tree, because it tends to be the biggest, the longest lived, and to be particularly useful for a whole range of purposes, as we'll come on to. But again, whatever people's feelings may have been about individual trees, perhaps special trees, when it came to the forests in general, the Celtic peoples cleared forests as much as the later arrivals of Saxons, Vikings, Normans, etc., who at various times invaded Britain. There doesn't seem to have been any special veneration of keeping a forest landscape in Britain. Clearance for farmland was more important. So what if there was a tree worship of some sort in a spiritual relationship? Did it continue? Christianity was adopted in Britain about 1400 years ago or so, and basically the oaks became part of the churches, a part of the fabric of them. It's tempting to suggest, did tree worship hang on in some form or other? And I rather like this painting, it's actually a German painting, as you can see from the caption, and it's called the 1,000-Year Oak. And if you look very closely at it, you can see that somewhere just under the branches, there is an icon of Christ on the cross. And of course, that's what the couple are kneeling down to worship. Or are they? Are they actually kneeling in front of the oak as the sort of veneration? Intriguing. But there really is no hard evidence for large-scale continuing tree worship in Britain through to the present. What is often picked up now is very largely a revival during the 19th century of interest in antiquities, in the legends of King Arthur and similar characters, and a general sort of romanticism for the past. And it's sort of captured in this verse of a rather nice poem that Rudyard Kipling wrote about trees. And he knew his trees, but it sort of implies that the people in Sussex were still going out to bring in the sun with the oak and the ash and thorn in midsummer. But it was a revival in the same way that maypoles and Morris dancing in its current form, largely a 19th century revival of maybe something a bit further back, but not largely. But something still hangs on. You do still find things like this tree in Cornwall, not an oak, I'm afraid, it's a thorn, which has got cloth and pieces of paper tied to it with messages on it by what is also known as a holy well, dedicated, I can't remember which saint it was, but to one particular saint. And in churches, there are lots of these, what are called foliate heads. So heads of men, assumed to be men, difficult, I think they've usually got bearded, so I think they probably are men, with oak leaves or other foliage coming out of their mouths or their noses and whirling round their heads. This particular one is on the beam in my house. That's a modern version. But actually, again, although these are widespread in churches and have been talked about as a link back to a possible tree worship, they don't seem to go back beyond the medieval period, and so they are probably a later addition. But we still plant trees to mark occasions. In this case, in the bottom left, a millennium oak, one of many planted around 2000, and to commemorate different events, people's birth, death, significant dates, significant occasions. Millions of trees will probably be planted next year when Queen Elizabeth, assuming she survives that long, will have been on the throne for 70 years and celebrating her Platinum Jubilee. And we see oaks as symbols of strength, longevity, continuity. So people and organizations adopt them and take them on, hoping that some of those characteristics will perhaps be rub off on them. So on the right-hand side, you've got the oak leaf outline and acorns, which are used by the National Trust for England, Wales, Northern Ireland, which is a body that aims to conserve both natural sites and also historic houses and so on. So it's using the oak leaf as a symbol of continuity in that way. And on the left, a pub sign commemorating the alleged hiding of King Charles in an oak tree when he was being chased by Oliver Cromwell's soldiers during the Civil War in the 17th century. And after the restoration of the monarchy at the end of that century, May the 29th was designated Oak Apple Day, and when my mother was at school, if you didn't have a sprig of oak leaves and an oak apple on your pin to your dress or your jacket when you went to school, you were likely to be beaten around the legs by stinging nettles because you're unpatriotic. So there. And this interest, particularly in the 19th century, developed in old trees and recognition that they sort of, were something unusual, started to develop, and people started to create lists of old trees that were of interesting shapes or which appeared to be particularly large for their species and for their size. Landscape gardeners like Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, who were redesigning the parks and land holdings of the gentry, would often incorporate these features in their designs so that your park would appear to therefore have a much older origin, perhaps, that because it got this old tree in it. And in some cases, they even moved old trees, not always successfully, but they attempted it. And people started to try and associate old trees with historical or not so historical figures. So the top left picture is the major oak in Sherwood. And it is, of course, where Robin Hood, as depicted by the statue next to the oak tree there, is meant to have hung out. Of course, Sherwood Forest at the time when Robin Hood might or might not have been living was a very open place, and he wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes before the sheriff of Nottingham found him. So don't believe what's in all the stories and ballads and things. But anyway, the major oak is there. It's still there. It's being propped up, as you can see, to try and maintain it. And from the 1990s, this interest in old trees really took off because it became appreciated that actually Britain has quite a high density of really old oaks. Some people claim we have more old oaks than the rest of Northwest Europe. I don't believe that. I think it's just that we've got they've been better documented in Britain. But we certainly have quite a lot. And they're not just of interest in their own right. They are. I mean, it's a fantastic individual being. But they're also very important for a whole range of deadwood invertebrates, or the lichens that live on their trunks, the birds that live in the nooks and crannies within their branches. So they're a fantastic biodiversity resource, a fantastic aesthetic resource. The picture on the book on the right there, does it look like a human to you? Someone holding out their hands going, no, keep that axe away from me. And again, down below, you can see another group of ancient tree enthusiasts going up to measure this giant in Chatsworth Park in Northern England. So there's still a great interest in old trees. And which has come through, and which perhaps you could say is a link back to what our early ancestors might have thought about the trees that they first encountered them. But they also, from our ancestors onwards, saw trees and woods as commodities, as essential parts of the way they lived. And they were not shy about necessarily cutting down big trees. Here, for example, on the left is a dugout canoe made of oak. I think the date is around 4,500 years ago. It's actually one from Dublin Museum, and it's 15 meters long. You don't get really big, straight old oaks these days in Britain, at least not that often. Sorry, that's the left-hand side. The right-hand picture is a little later rather. It's only 3,500 years old. It's what's known as the Dover boat. It's made from 4 oak trees, which are sort of cut into L-shaped and almost stitched together with yew twigs. And each of those trees is estimated to be about 1 meter across and 9 meters to the first major branch. Again, not the sorts of trees that are that common in Britain today, but clearly we did grow them once. It's quite possible that this Dover boat was actually seagoing. It's thought it wouldn't necessarily be that good in rough weather, but you could probably get across the channel on it on a good day. But as I say, where have all these oak trees gone? Well, the first thing to stress is that certainly in Britain, we have no untouched virgin old growth stands as they exist in parts of Central and Eastern Europe or in North America. We're looking at the British landscape entirely at cultural landscapes that have been altered for hundreds, in many cases thousands of years by human activity. There are 9th century records of trees being used as boundary markers. And that implies you've got an open landscape beyond so that the tree is distinctive. By the 11th century, it's estimated that woodland cover in England might only have been about 15%. Only about half what European average is now. And the sorts of woods that we've got, starting from the right, there's the sort of landscape you've got in Britain. Woods are tiny, managed fragments in an agricultural landscape. Within the woods, the middle one is from Wales. They are relatively small trees because they have been cut over many times until, in a lot of cases, the last 50 to 100 years when they've largely been neglected. Where you do get big old trees, and that's the left-hand picture, which is an example of a park in Edinburgh, then this is usually because they've been set aside as a deer park, but they would have been managed, probably cut over at 3 or 4 meters high so that you could harvest the timber without the deer or the cattle then being able to eat the regrowth. And throughout the last 1,000 years, one of the reasons we know something of our history of our woodland is because of the records of disputes about the use of the wood, that too much wood was going for charcoal for making iron and not enough going into naval timbers. Probably because the government never paid enough to the woodland owners to get the best timber. They would rather sell it to the ironmasters. And that sort of debate from the 16th century, it goes through 17th, 18th century. The ship, by the way, is HMS Victory. that Lord Nelson died on at the Battle of Trafalgar, through into the 19th century. And then there's a change because shipbuilding goes out of fashion, or at least wooden shipbuilding does. And suddenly the need for oak to make these boats declines. Charcoal is no longer needed for iron smelting because there's coke and other processes. So the 1924 census says oak planting has gone out of fashion in favour of conifers, the timber that we use mostly today. And you can see what happened in the 20th century, just in this graph. The blue lines are total woodland cover in Britain, and note that it starts at 5% land surface around 1924. The clearance that started in the Neolithic period went on right the way through down to 5% cover. We're not yet up to the cover that we had 1,000 years ago at the time of Doomsday. The red bars are for broadleaf, so roughly could equivalent, that's the equivalent of native woodland. And the little green bar is the area of oak woodland. Basically, it's just been sitting there for the last 100 years, not really changing that much. So where are we going with our relationship with oak? We're going to need different woods and trees for different purposes. And while many people don't like these big conifer plantations, if Britain is to reduce its global footprint, we can't just do it with oak. We need the timber that we use, which is mostly coniferous and of introduced species, but that's what we use. We can use areas of oak woodland for recreation, but we'll have to keep them quite open, and that will favour some species and not others. We might try and recreate the sorts of management that took place in the last 1,000 years, which benefits flowers and butterflies and some of the birds that we associate with woods, such as the bottom right there, which is oak over hazel coppice. But if we're to favour oak, we need to recognise that actually, under current climate conditions, it's outcompeted by beech in many sites. So if we want oak, we will have to fell the beech. We will have to clear invasive rhododendron. We will have to shoot the deer, because otherwise we will not get the regeneration. So I'm hoping we will move to a more respectful relationship with the trees and woods, but that is going to include felling them to meet our needs, as throughout history. It will mean planting new oak woods probably, as well as letting other areas run wild and hopefully keep some of the oak in place. And we shouldn't necessarily see using felling oak trees as destroying them. In a way, the top right picture is a 1,000-year-old oak. It's a little church near where I was born. The timber was felled about 900 in the AD, so about 1,100 years ago. The trees were about 150 years old when they were felled, and they've stood for another 1,000 years. And we perhaps shouldn't be too uptight about death of oak trees, because it is, after all, a natural process. Most acorns don't become seedlings, seedlings don't become mature trees, most mature oaks don't become ancient. And the biodiversity associated with oak is often involved with their consumption decay. So I think showing respect and responsibility for trees and woods makes economic sense. It gives us a feeling for the past. Wildlife will benefit, aesthetically pleasing. But remember, these are all human values and human perspectives. I'm not sure I want to know what an oak thinks of how we've treated them for the last 10,000 years. It might not be very polite. And I'll leave you with a quote, which is actually about elm, but it might be about oak. Elm she hateth mankind and waiteth, and elm trees then drop their branches. I wouldn't like to be under an oak branch when it drops. Thank you.
Keith, congratulations. Very fascinating presentation. I think I speak on behalf of everybody present today. We did receive 4 questions, and many of them are, you've touched on, but you can expand upon. One viewer asked, why oak in particular? Why not some other hardwood or some other tree species?
I think it's because certainly for the last few hundred years, oak has been the most valuable hardwood timber in Britain. And it was grown for many purposes, but it was the tree that was favored by foresters. And so in the early 20th century, as ecology developed, people actually classified most of our woods as oak woods, even though we now realize that a lot of other species would probably take over if they're given the chance. So that's one reason. And the other thing is that it does live so long. And so although other trees, particularly yew, to a lesser extent, beech and ash, will form these veterans, these massive old individuals, the vast majority that we've got in Britain are oak. So again, that continuity, that long-lived age of the trees, I think it has a particular attraction to people.
And your recent answer, I think, touches on the first question that was offered up by Mr. Ryan 2 days ago in anticipation of your presentation. I think you've touched on it with your answer, with your presentation, but how do plants or how do oaks change our perception of time?
It's an interesting one, because if you think about there is a saying that an oak grows for 300 years, stands for 300 years, and lies for 300 years as it decays. Well, a few of them might live for 900 years, but they're probably the exceptions. But if you start thinking, an ordinary oak could easily live for 300-400 years. And then you start thinking, well, that's only about 20, 30 generations back, almost to the Ice Age. And it's such a different scale to that at which we are used to working. I sort of work in, there's a tree in Whiteham Woods which is thought to be perhaps 600 years old. I go past it regularly and I'm thinking, you've stood there 600 years. I've not yet got to 60 years here.
Well, thank you. I have a 150-year-old bur oak in my front yard here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and that pales in comparison to the one you walk by regularly, 600 years, or the ones in your presentation. Keith, a few more questions. We have about 5 minutes or so. Some very fascinating questions from our colleagues here, asking questions about climate change, climate resilience, this southern oak, subspecies that are migrating to Britain and elsewhere north. And can you share some of your thoughts on this matter? Is this problematic or is this natural?
It's a tricky one. There are a number of different areas. First of all, we've got this issue that beech, which was a late arrival in Britain, is still in effect, could be seen as spreading naturally through the country, and it's more shade tolerant and it will top the oaks and kill them. So we have to make a decision. Are we prepared to, do we want to stop the natural process, if you like, of succession because we favor oak over beech? Then again, there's certainly climate change, and in particular droughts, extreme summer droughts do seem to be threatening, putting a lot of our old oaks under pressure. And we've got examples of where we can track the decline in the ring width back to particular dry oak years. And it may also make them more vulnerable to various pests and diseases. So that's another angle that we're having to look through. And the question of what, if with climate change species are moving north, well, one of the species that is moving north, or certainly doing better now in Britain, than it did, is an oak, Quercus ilex, which is more of a Mediterranean species, gets into about central France, but it will grow now in southern Britain, and it can invade particularly some of our grassland sites rather than the woodland, but it will also grow in the woodland. So we again, there's a dilemma. To what extent do we accept that as a natural process or as an invasive species that we should be trying to control?
Thank you. We have a question here from a Mr. Stone, Duncan Stone, asking about, maybe you know Mr. Stone here, encouraging you to elaborate on our relationship with oak and trees. Sometimes the feeling may be of a one-way relationship, but Mr. Stone is asking, what do you think should be our relationship with oak? What should be our responsibility for these species?
I think it should be to show respect, but then that should apply, I think, to the whole living world. But we can't get away from the fact that we use timber, we use natural products, and that will mean the destruction of trees and woodland, or at least the cutting down of woodland, and hopefully, and then its regeneration. And so we need to do that in a respectful way, a sustainable way, a way, and to take account of the future generations. Try and make sure that the legacy that we leave is at least as rich as that we have inherited. We will make mistakes. We know people in the past have made mistakes in terms of how they've used land and used natural resources. Sometimes they were aware of it and sometimes they weren't. And in the same way, we can try and be aware when we're of what we're doing and not do things wrongly, but sometimes we will do things wrongly because we just don't know enough. So yeah, I think that's probably enough.
Thank you, Keith. We have 1 minute remaining. I don't know if you wanted to, close with any parting thoughts for those in attendance today, this evening, this afternoon, this morning.
Yeah, I think it's just that one, just sort of, if the oak ever does decide to tell us what it thinks, just to be careful. And so that's another reason perhaps for showing respect to these trees. They're a lot bigger than we are. If they ever want to, they can really make it difficult for us.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you to all for your attendance. today. And with that, Christina and I will draw this session to a close. Please check out Christina's literary and cultural plant studies network at plants.arizona.edu. Thank you. See you at the next session.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Keith.